In 1914, the Germans entered the war with quite unreal assumptions about its origin, about its nature, and about its objectives. They had developed a huge assembly of claims, which in fact would have meant that Europe could be dominated by German hegemony totally, and were mentally not willing to forfeit this all in 1918 and 1919. Wolfgang Mommsen. The Treaty of Versailles was supposed to be responsible for ending the war to end all wars, yet failed even being the contributing factor of World War II. World War I was a global war centered in Europe that began on July 28, 1914, and lasted until November 11, 1918. On June 28, 1914, the Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by Serbian nationalists. An escalation of threats and mobilization orders followed the incident to the outbreak of World War I, which pitted Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, or Central Powers, against Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, and Japan, also known as the Allied Powers. Within weeks, the major powers were at war, and the conflict soon spread around the world. The 4 years of World War I was responsible for unprecedented levels of destruction, thanks to the trench warfare and the introduction of modern weaponry, such as machine guns, tanks, and chemical weapons. The Central Powers were unraveling and couldn't keep up with the Allied powers, who were well supplied and coordinated. The Central Powers were then forced to surrender and seek armistice. By the end of the war, 4 major imperial powers, the German, Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires, ceased to exist. On November 11, 1918, the war ended, to the dismay of the German troops and to the jubilation of the Allied forces. World War I was responsible for 9 million deaths and over 21 million wounded. The armistice led to the writing of the Treaty of Versailles. An aggravated situation between the United States, Britain, and France led the United States to not ratify into the League of Nations, and left Britain and France responsible for creating peace. The League of Nations formed with the aim of preventing any repetition of an appalling conflict. The aim failed, with weakened states, renewed European nationalism, and the German feeling of humiliation contributing to the rise of fascism and the conditions for World War II. The Treaty of Versailles was responsible for determining the post-war borders from Europe to the Middle East, establishing the League of Nations as an international peace organization, and punishing Germany for its aggression, with reparations and the loss of territory. The instability caused by World War I would help lead to a second international conflict.
On January 18, 1919, 70 delegates from 27 countries assembled in Paris to determine how to deal with the defeated empires. The Paris Peace Conference was responsible for finding a compromise that everyone from the Allied side could agree on and turn it into a treaty. Every representative had to compromise some of what they wanted to appease others while still holding on to the main points that they wished to achieve. During the creation of this treaty, Germany was not allowed to help due to them being seen as responsible for the war. A Council of 10 was then created, consisting of political leaders from all the major powers that fought on the winning side of the war, including the United States, Great Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and a few of the smaller powers. The Council had managed to confront the minor details, but had forgotten to address the major problem: what Germany's ramifications would entail. On May 27, 1919, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States of America, Prime Minister of Britain, David Lloyd George, Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Emanuele Orlando, and French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau met in Paris for a conference. The Council of 10 had suddenly become the Council of 4, shutting out all the other powers that had aided in ending the war and focusing only on the largest and strongest. These 4 leaders of the Allied powers led and created most of the Treaty of Versailles. Article 231, more commonly known as the War Guilt Clause, is the article listed that solely blames Germany for World War I. Out of the 4 large powers, France was certainly the harshest towards Germany because a majority of the fighting in World War I occurred there, causing major destruction. Not only did Germany invade France during the First World War, but also during the Franco-Prussian War. Clemenceau argued that the United States and Great Britain were sheltered far away from what Germany could do and would not be affected nearly as much as they would. Sadly for Germany, Clemenceau achieved most of his goals, crippling Germany's economy, exacting the vengeance that he had craved. Although the United States played a large role in the creation of the treaty, Wilson opted not to sign it and created a separate treaty with Germany instead. When the Germans were told about the Treaty of Versailles, they were told they either had to sign it or the war would resume. Gustav Bauer soon took over after Philip Scheidemann refused to sign and capitulated, not wanting to go to war. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919, at Versailles Palace in the Hall of Mirrors. The treaty was said to be responsible for ending the war to end all wars and creating world peace. It required Germany to be held accountable for everything that had happened during the Great War. Germany was forced to pay reparations, give up the land they had taken, and had decisively reduced their army. Other than just blaming Germany, the Treaty of Versailles was responsible for creating the League of Nations. The League of Nations was the outcome of the treaty that was supposed to enforce peaceful resolutions to warring and conflicted countries. However, the treaty clearly failed in this aspect, even being a major cause for World War II.
As a result of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to take responsibility for World War I. In the treaty, Germany lost 15% of its land, including the coal mining Saarland and the regions of Alsace-Lorraine. They were forced to pay $33 billion in reparations, which is the equivalent of $442 billion today. In addition to the economic consequences of the treaty, Germany was required to demilitarize the Rhineland and was subjected to great limitations on the size of its military and air force. Germany was stripped of its colonies and was forced to forfeit land. The treaty also took great measures to ensure that Germany would not expand. The German people were very unhappy about the treaty and thought that it was too harsh. Germany could barely afford to sustain its own economy during the global economic depression, let alone pay the enormous reparations the treaty had imposed upon them. There were not many jobs, and the price of food and basic goods was high. People were dissatisfied with the government and voted to empower a man who promised to regain what was lost in the treaty for Germany. His name was Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, the leader of the Nazi Party, was elected as Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933. He quickly moved from Chancellor to dictator, thinking that this would give him the power to overthrow the treaty. He was easily able to gain power due to the uproar that the treaty had provided, and he enabled law that eliminated all opposition to him. Hitler promised to rebuild the country, and once he did, he would reinstate Germany's former governmental system. Mad with power, Hitler set off not only to rebuild the country, but to take revenge on the ones that caused the country's hardship in the first place. He turned much of his attention to the Jewish population, whom he held responsible for Germany's loss of the First World War. He believed that the annihilation of the Jews was completely necessary. He stated, "By fighting the Jews, I'm doing the Lord's work." So he instituted the largest massacre of human life in the history of civilization, the Holocaust. On top of all this, Hitler stopped paying the reparations Germany was responsible for paying, but instead put money back into the German economy. He disregarded the demilitarization laws and increased the size of the army from 100,000 personnel to 900,000. He also remilitarized the Rhineland, even though it was supposed to be occupied by Allied forces for at least 15 years. Hitler also made an alliance with Austria, going against the rules of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler's reign as dictator was a direct result of the outcome of the Treaty of Versailles. Without this treaty, the Second World War could have been avoided.
To what extent will the injustices given in the Treaty of Versailles haunt the war-free future we also desire?